Next, we're going to talk about how populations evolve. Evolution is genetic change in a population of organisms through time, or the characteristics of a population of organisms change through time. That's a very specific definition of biological evolution. What exactly is a population? A population is a group of individuals of the same species, and they're interacting with each other in different ways. They could be competing with each other, mating with each other, cooperating, helping each other out. Different species, the individuals interact in different ways. And quite often, more often than not, members of a population are more closely related to each other than they are with members of a different population. And populations in a certain area, they have similar characteristics. For example, think of populations of humans in Northern Europe versus populations of humans in Africa. Can you think of any differences between them? Populations of humans in Northern Europe, they tend to have a lot less pigmentation in their skin. Their skin is a lot lighter. Their hair color and eye color is a lot lighter. Whereas people in Africa, their skin tends to be darker. There's more pigmentation, more melanin. Their hair and their eyes are darker. There's some physical differences. And these are adaptations to local conditions. For example, in Africa, it's closer to the equator, and sunlight is more intense, and that darker skin helps protect them against intense ultraviolet radiation. On the other hand, in more northern latitudes, closer to the poles, sunlight is less intense, and people do need some sunlight, some ultraviolet radiation to help them make vitamin D. So as people migrated around the world over hundreds of thousands of years, or maybe, well, hundreds of thousands of years, they adapted to local conditions. And another term in populations is a gene pool. These are the genes and alleles, variations of the genes that are in that population. And these genes, their frequencies change through time. The population changes through time. The population evolves. And individuals and populations differ. Think about humans. We all look different from each other. We have different characteristics. Our physiologies differ. How we work internally differs from one person to the next. Why are we different from each other? What controls how we look? What controls our physiology, how we work? Our genes. And genes change. The genes of a population change through time, and they adapt to local conditions, they adapt to changing environments. Also, genes can mutate. Genes can change through mutations. For example, in DNA, adenine may be replaced by a guanine by mistake, and that may result in the characteristics of an individual changing, and if that changing characteristic is beneficial, it can increase in the population. And changes in genes are called what? Well, if we're talking about the genetic change in a population of organisms through time, that's evolution. But if we're talking about a change in an individual gene, that's a mutation. And sexual reproduction increases variability in different ways. Genes are recombined. Two different individuals mate with each other and they contribute different genes to their offspring, and crossing over occurs in meiosis. Independent assortment occurs during meiosis, the production of sex cells, sperm cells, egg cells, pollen grains, and that shuffles genes around and increases variation. Now, in evolution, talking about how genes change through time, we can compare these changing populations to a population that does not change. And these populations are not changing. Their genes don't change over time. The frequency of their alleles don't change through time. And these are ideal populations because populations do actually change through time. They can change pretty quickly or change slowly. But this ideal population that's unchanging is called a hardy Weinberg population. And there are some equations that can show how this population is not changing. And we can compare changing populations to this hardy Weinberg population to see exactly how populations are changing, how the different alleles are increasing or decreasing in frequency. Next, we're going to get into how populations change. What are the mechanisms of evolution? Well, by far, the most common one is natural selection. This is what Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace discovered in the early to mid 1800s. This is what Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species is about. And populations are highly variable. Some of these variations help an organism leave behind more successful offspring. These beneficial variations increase in frequency in the population. These beneficial variations are selected for, and the population changes. There are also some random changes that occur through time. And these random changes are called genetic drift. And a couple of examples of genetic drift include the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. In the bottleneck effect, a large population is reduced. Could be a fire, could be a volcanic eruption, could be a severe drought that wiped out all their food. But the population is decimated not because of something they could adapt to, but something pretty intense that just wipes it out. And then the smaller population is randomly different than the original population. And then the population rebounds, and the rebounding population has fewer genes, fewer alleles than the original population. So in this figure on the left, we have a bottle with a bunch of beads in it. There are red ones, yellow ones, green ones, blue ones, and then only a few beads are poured out of this bottle. And just by random chance, the ones that end up in the small beaker are blue and green and yellow. There aren't any red ones. So these beads represent individuals in a population and they rebound, and the new population is less diverse, less variable than the original population. An example of this: cheetahs in Africa. Their populations have been decimated. In the past, in 1900, there were 100,000 individuals in certain areas in Africa, and that was reduced to 10,000. They were hunted. The grasslands, the savannas in Africa where they live were converted into crops. Climate change has caused things to dry out, and a lot of these grasslands have turned into deserts, and they are extinct in more than 20 different countries now. So the populations have been very, very much reduced, and these individuals are reproducing with each other. There's nobody else to reproduce with except close relatives, and their genetics are very, very similar to each other. Their variability has been greatly reduced, and they're so similar that they can accept skin grafts from each other. Skin grafts are like organ transplants, and they're so genetically similar to each other that these organ transplants are not rejected. So that's a bottleneck effect. The population crashes, it's much smaller than it was before, and as a result, it's much less diverse. Another type of genetic drift is called a founder effect. And what happens, a small subset of a population founds a new population in a new place. And the ones that found a new population are just randomly genetically different than the original population. For example, we have some red and green beetles, and they start a new population some distance away, and only red beetles end up in this new population, so the new population is different than the original one. An example of this: population of Amish people in the United States. This was started from a small population of colonists, and they're isolated. They don't reproduce much with other people. They tend just to reproduce with other Amish people. And the individuals that founded this small population had a certain disorder. It's a type of dwarfism where polydactyly occurs. And they have not only dwarfism, they're small, but they also have maybe some extra fingers and toes. And this polydactyly is more frequent in this population than they are in the original population where they came from. And then here's a figure of this, and the population they originally came from had a frequency of this about 1 in 1,000 people, but in the United States This population has frequency of this disorder at the frequency of 1 in 14. So that's the founder effect. The smaller population that was founded had this disorder, so the resulting population, the genes are different. Next, we're going to get into natural selection in some more detail. And natural selection can cause populations to change in different ways over time. Natural selection leads to adaptations. And there are 3 types of natural selection. One type is called stabilizing selection. And the average characteristic is selected for. The extremes are selected against. Think about how much babies weigh. Usually somewhere around 6 to 8 pounds. In the past, if they weighed a lot less than that, 1 or 2 pounds, they were premature, they didn't survive, they were underdeveloped. And if they weighed more like 10 or 12 pounds, they had trouble getting out of the mother, and quite often they died during childbirth. So most frequently, babies are born that weigh between 6 to 8 pounds. But what about more recently? Premature babies, tiny babies can be cared for better. They survive better. And what happens if a baby is born that's just really huge? How does it get out of the mother? By cesarean section. So I think that this stabilizing selection over time is not going to be quite, the population not going to be quite so average, and the population is going to change because of medical technology. This stabilizing selection is going to be counteracted, and more tiny babies are going to survive, and more huge babies are going to survive. But they won't get quite that huge. These are just a couple of fun pictures I found on the internet. Another type of selection is called directional selection. And this is probably what happens most of the time. And in directional selection, the average characteristic of a population changes. For example, in the 1940s, we first started using antibiotics, and all of the population of bacteria was susceptible to antibiotics. Now the average characteristic of some of those populations have changed, especially around hospitals where many of the populations of bacteria are more resistant to antibiotics. The average characteristics of the population changed. And what happened? In certain areas, we used a lot of the antibiotics. We killed off the susceptible ones. Populations of bacteria are highly variable, and some of them were resistant to the antibiotics. That resistance allowed these individuals to leave behind more offspring than their neighbors. And this characteristic of being resistant to antibiotics increased in frequency in the population. There's a classic example of a type of moth in England called a peppered moth. And people in England have been collecting moths for hundreds of years. It was a popular pastime, especially among wealthier individuals. And they would collect pretty butterflies and moths and sometimes other insects. Going back in time before the 1800s, most of the population was light in color. And then something happened starting in the 1800s. Most of the population became dark in color. The average characteristic of the population changed. And then over the past couple of decades or so, the population's changing back to its lighter color. The average characteristic of the population is becoming more and more light. There are a few dark individuals that pop up now again that we see, but mostly they're light in color. So what happened here? Well, before the 1800s, these light-colored moths rested on trees during the day, branches, trunks. And if a dark one showed up in the population, this dark moth seen on a light background, it was seen easily by birds and eaten. And so a dark color was really disadvantageous. A lighter color matched the light background of the trees they were resting on. And so the characteristic of being light in color was pretty high in the population. And then around the 1800s, the trees changed. They started becoming dark in color. So the dark coloration had an advantage. It increased in frequency in the population. Birds ate them less often, and the lighter colored moths became more rare. And that was because birds were eating them more frequently. Well, what happened in the 1800s? Maybe a little bit before. Why did trees become dark? The Industrial Revolution. Manufacturing plants were burning trees and were burning coal. There was a lot of air pollution, a lot of soot turned those tree trunks dark. The pollution killed off an organism that grew on the tree trunks called lichen, which were light in color. They tend to be somewhat sensitive to changes in the environment. So air pollution darkened the tree trunks and the tree branches, and the population of moths changed. They adapted to that darker color. And then more recently, the tree trunks have been turning light again because of pollution controls. There's not as much pollution. We're just naturally switching away from coal and burning trees. We're using natural gas and other forms of energy. It's not quite as polluting. So directional selection, the average characteristics of a population change through time. Then there's disruptive selection. The extremes are selected for, and the averages are selected against. And so you have a population that has more highly variable characteristics. A good example of this has been shown in Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. And there's one couple there that's been studying these finches for many decades, and they found that when there's a lot of rainfall, there's a wide variety of seeds, and the population of finches becomes more average. And the beak size of these finches is kind of medium-sized, and these medium-sized finches, finches with the medium-sized beaks, can eat a wide variety of seed types. But when droughts came and it stopped raining, there were only two kinds of seeds that survived on these islands. Very large seeds and very small seeds. And so the populations of finches changed. There were some species that had bigger beaks, and the beaks became bigger. The bigger size was selected for. They could eat the tougher, bigger seeds. And the other species of finch, the beak size became smaller, and they could eat on the smaller seeds. They could feed on the smaller seeds. So you had some large finches with large beaks and finches with small beaks. The ones that were intermediate were selected against. Another example occurs in certain populations of salmon. Larger salmon, they can compete with each other. The males compete with each other. The largest fish get to fertilize the eggs more often, and so this large size is selected for. And there are also some sneaky small males. While the bigger males are fighting, the smaller males sneak in and fertilize the female's eggs. And in fish, most of them, they lay their eggs in the water, and then the males release their sperm. There's external fertilization. And so these small, sneaky males have also been selected for. So some of the males are really big, some of the males are really small. The intermediate sized ones, they don't do as well. They can't be quite as sneaky. They're too big for that, and they're not big enough to compete with the large males. So another example of disruptive selection. And natural selection isn't perfect. It acts on historical constraints. It acts on what's available. And what's available has changed. For example, certain primates lost their tails. Humans, great apes, gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, for whatever evolutionary reason they lost their tails. But they still have remnants of these tails, coccyx bones. And these coccyx bones, if, for example, we fall on our butts, for example, that coccyx bone can be broken. And think of bats and their wings. They have the same bones in their wings that we have in their hands, our hands. So in the past, their ancestors were just four-legged little mammals, and they got better and better at gliding, and a membrane grew between the fingers, and they developed into wings, but they still have the same hand bones that we do. The same way with aquatic mammals. The forelimbs of whales and dolphins, they have the same bones in their hands that we do, because their ancestors had those same bones, same as our ancestors. So natural selection can only work with what's there. And sometimes compromises are made. For example, sea lions, seals, they're great swimmers. Same way with penguins, they're really good at swimming. They have webbed feet. Their front legs are well adapted as almost like fins. But they're really, really clumsy on land. And they still come up on land because they are mammals or birds in the case of penguins. They are air breathers. They reproduce on land. They're getting away from predators such as sharks. But they're really, really clumsy on land. But that's less important than being really good swimmers so they can catch their prey and escape things that are eating them. And sometimes chance does play a role in evolution. Chance changes occur in the environment, and natural selection takes advantage of these changes, and chance and natural selection and the environment interact with each other. For example, 65 million years ago, before that, a couple 100 million years ago to 65 million years ago, the Earth was ruled by reptiles, dinosaurs, large ones and small ones. And mammals were limited to very small animals, kind of like mice and squirrels. They weren't that diverse, and they were trying to avoid being eaten and stepped on by these large reptiles. And then 65 million years ago, something happened that wiped out almost all the dinosaurs. And that left various ways of living or ecological niches available to mammals. And afterwards, they greatly diversified. And the time period since 65 million years ago to present sometimes is referred to as the age of mammals. So a chance change in the environment, most likely it's pretty well accepted. It was a meteor impact in the Yucatan Peninsula. That chance change in the environment affected life on Earth and how evolution occurred. So chance, natural selection, the environment, they all interact with each other to cause populations to evolve. And chance, we talked about genetic drift earlier, which includes the bottleneck effect and the founder effect.